The Philippine strongman speaks while a nation listens on. He's strong criticism for fighting a pandemic with the same lethal force as the war on drugs. But will those tactics work when it comes to saving a sinking economy and waning popularity? I'm Ali Aslan, and today's newsmaker is President Rodrigo Duterte. Duterte's address to the nation delivered a mixed bag of messages on everything from crime and punishment to COVID-19. One moment he was praising his country's response to the outbreak, the next threatening to personally execute lawbreakers. For 4 years, Dutertismo has ruled the Philippines with a golden tongue backed by an iron fist. But with just a third of his time in office remaining, there are rumors he could be maneuvering for a way to stay. In the meantime, the president has his hands full preparing the nation, as he says, for worse times to come. Natalie Pahonen reports.
When the pandemic struck, I decided to prioritize life over other considerations. Buhay muna bago lahat. Ayaw kong lalaruan ng Philippines. Do not do it in my country because I will really kill you. That is a commitment. Kung malik kayo sa dati, kagaya noon, patok-patong na naman ang patay dito. Sigurado,
Tough talk is a hallmark of the Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte. His supporters and critics alike have come to expect nothing less, even when he's delivering his State of the Nation address. While the president covered a range of issues, the subject that matters most right now is the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And Duterte acknowledged it's been far from perfect. The Philippines instituted one of the world's strictest lockdowns. There have been mass arrests for curfew and quarantine violations, and, along with them, allegations that security forces have been too heavy-handed. The crisis has had a drastic effect on unemployment. It rose to a record high in April, with 7.3 million people left jobless. And despite the hardline approach to curbing the virus, there have been more than 80,000 cases and nearly 2,000 deaths. Ahead of Duterte's speech, there were protests against the government in Manila and other regions. They've also happened in previous years, just never with the threat of the virus.
Some people went out because they recognized the need to be present, to be physically here in the streets to express their sentiments, their outrage, their utter disappointment with the way things are being handled right now.
Another looming concern for many of these demonstrators is the newly passed Anti-Terrorism Act. The government says it's necessary to protect the country from insurgencies, and that if you're a law-abiding citizen, you have nothing to fear. But rights groups argue that it could have a chilling effect on civil liberties and be used to target critics of Duterte and his administration. Legal challenges to annul the law are already underway. Activists say all of this is happening at a time when press freedom and the space for open dissent is already under threat. There are 2 years left in Duterte's presidency. He's steadfastly held on to the tough-on-crime strongman persona he campaigned on. But will he have to change to take on the nation's #1 enemy, a virus that can't be corralled by an iron-fisted approach? Natalie Pahonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's go to Manila first. Stephen Cutler is a former chief of FBI operations in the Philippines. Jose Custodio was a consultant to former President Benigno Aquino III, who was in power between 2010 to 2016. And in Melbourne, we have Barton. He's a professor of global Islamic politics at Deakin University and an expert in Southeast Asia. Gentlemen, welcome. Good to have you on the program. Jose, President Duterte in the State of the Union address defended his administration's record, but the numbers do not work in his favor, do they? For one, the cases of coronavirus are rising rapidly. Now the Philippines have more cases than China even. The economy is down, unemployment is very high, and a looming recession. The pressure he's facing, how much under pressure is Duterte at the moment?
Well, the thing is that if you see the rallies, you would see there that the people, the government, those who are critical of the government are that frustrated that they have braved the fear of the virus, and they are out in numbers in the streets. Okay, and this is not This is not the first time this has happened. There was even a larger, just as large rally that was done a few weeks ago when the government shut down a private station that was seen as critical of the Duterte administration. That was the ABS-CBN channel. So Duterte is aware of the pressure that is mounting and the fact that it has affected the ordinary Filipinos. Prior to the pandemic, the level of discontent was not really that felt from a national level, precisely because of the fact that the ordinary people were not affected by what was going on. But with the pandemic, the ordinary man on the street is now affected. Then you have even sectors who have been reeling from the effects of this prolonged quarantine. And there's no end in sight because of the fact that the administration has had problems in dealing with the pandemic, lacking. Some critics are saying that it actually lacks a coherent strategy, which is why the numbers are increasing.
And indeed, the numbers are increasing, Stephen, despite one of the world's strictest lockdowns, having even seen the military cracking down on quarantine violators. So now, of course, Duterte's authoritarian and centralized rule is increasingly under criticism because it is proving to be ineffective in this particular case, namely in the fight against the coronavirus.
Yeah, I think it is. I think one of the problems that we face here in the Philippines is that there is a real strong deficit of trust in the government. And unfortunately, for many people, they like the strongman rule, but there are also a lot of people who are very scarred and remember the days of martial law, where people disappeared and there were properties were seized and so on. And so they're really having to battle the memories and the scars from the 1970s and 1980s. And that's a real problem that I don't know how to fix, quite frankly.
Greg, indeed, the fix won't be easy and won't be coming anytime soon if we are looking at the numbers. Interestingly enough, Duterte has applied the same heavy-handed tactics on the coronavirus as he did on the war on drugs, which, according to the UN, has killed more than 8,000 Filipinos since 2016. Seems like a fairly disproportionate response, doesn't it?
That's right. The war on drugs has not only been terribly brutal, lots of extrajudicial killings, it's a human rights travesty, but it hasn't really fixed the Philippines' drug problems. Ironically, the heavy-handed approach to COVID-19 has been relatively more effective, but of course that deficit in trust is a key factor limiting the effectiveness right now.
And if we're looking at what he's trying to do at this particular point, Greg, now, of course, in the midst of this grueling pandemic, he himself, President Duterte, has introduced a new anti-terrorism law. Before we go into details of this law, do you think this is a distraction tactic on his part to distract and overcompensate from his poor handling of the coronavirus?
To be fair, it's been long in preparation. It's a terrible piece of legislation, but it does fit with Duterte's overall style of lack of accountability and just a brutal approach. No doubt it is a welcome distraction at this time because the strongman tactics aren't working when it comes to popular trust in him with respect to COVID-19. He's a very popular president despite his authoritarian ways, but COVID-19 is finding him coming up short. So yes, this is a welcome distraction, but it's been long planned.
And Jose, if we're looking at the details of this new anti-terrorism law, it could jail suspects without charge for weeks and potentially have Duterte use the law to prosecute political opponents. We've already seen a couple of high-profile cases where the government has shut down the broadcaster ABS-CBN and, of course, convicted internationally known Philippine journalist Maria Ressa for cyber libel. Do you fear a further erosion of civil liberties in the Philippines is to come?
It's always with the problem here in the Philippines is that it is always the manner of the way the law is implemented and of the implementing agencies themselves. Okay, as we have seen during the quarantine, that for example, the Philippine police were not just very heavy-handed, but also in the sense that they were also not fair in the implementation of laws or of regulations. Okay, so there were policemen who were seen violating the laws or violating the regulations, and yet they were not sanctioned by the very government themselves. So that type of situation then encourages what we would call abuse. Okay, it enables an institution to practice impunity, and that is what people fear here, is that even before the enactment of this law, many in the police were already acting with a sense of impunity. In fact, the war on drugs itself was a very good example of impunity. And now in this particular law, the fact that you can be tagged as a terrorist by virtue of a council whose members are practically stacked with Duterte appointees, that then raises a lot of concerns about how this law will be utilized. Okay, especially in the next 2 years, we will have national elections. So will this law play a part in intimidating opposition, especially in the fact that the coronavirus, the pandemic itself, has been mishandled? Thus, you have a lot of dissent and discontent happening. So this law may actually be used from a national perspective, but if you go to the grassroots, to the level of the ordinary policeman and the ordinary citizen, is that this type of law can actually enable even minor abuses.
Right,
okay, from
Stephen,
men who
and as Jose said, Duterte has 2 years left in his term. Of course, he has his work cut out for himself. COVID-19 is not going to go away anytime soon. High unemployment, economy in a recession, and the Philippine economy pretty much bogged down. How do you foresee the next 2 years playing out for him?
It's going to be very tough because what he's had is what I'll call a tsunami of events. This terrorism law, or the anti-terrorism law, is actually, in my view, is needed because it needed to clean up some of the counterterrorism financing issues that the Philippines was not addressing before. We in the Philippines would have been placed under a FATA, for the Financial Action Task Force, anti-money laundering regimes. We would have been placed on the gray list, and that would have been terrible for the country. So we needed to have some of the sections that this new anti-terrorism law put into place. Let me also add that if there are violations of the law itself provides for a 10-year jail term for the police, military, and the unit commanders of people who are violating the laws. But he's had a whole lot of things come together for him that put him in a very, very difficult position. It's like a boxer trying to take on 2 or 3 opponents at the same time for a heavyweight title.
Yes, certainly a long list of challenges that he's facing at the moment, not just domestically, Greg, but also internationally. He is trying to toe the line with both the US and China, trying not to aggravate one side or the other. Quite a very delicate balancing act there, isn't it?
It's a very delicate balancing act, and some might say, giving him benefit of the doubt, that he's playing a clever game. Others might say that it's a very dangerous game that's going to catch him out. Ending the visiting forces agreement with US military presence, which will run out in November, will mean that if his game of engagement with China doesn't work, he's not going to have the American ally to fall back on the way that he had previously. So it's very high stakes.
Very high stakes indeed. Jose, you have advised the previous Philippine president. If you were to be called upon and asked for your advice as to how to devise and create the next 2 difficult years for the Philippines, what would be your list of priorities?
Well, from the very start would be to approach the pandemic response in a science-based, a medical aspect, to fix the medical component of the pandemic response, because that is exactly what is the problem that is going on here in this country right now, is that the medical response, the health component, is in disarray and confused. And because of that, we have a lot of problems from the national sector all the way down to the local governments. In fact, the vice president herself had come up with a list of suggestions that would provide some strategic direction to what was going on. The problem here in the Philippines is that in the past a half year since the quarantines and the lockdowns began, the level of dissent, even within the government's pandemic response, has been of much concern to all of us who are observing it, because of the fact that you have consultants from the government itself disagreeing with each other, officials disagreeing with each other, and that also explains a lot of why the virus has spread, why the pandemic has spread, precisely because the government has not gotten its act together. So I would concentrate on that.
So
that would be the priority.
Right. So an emphasis to fix the poor public health infrastructure of the Philippines, which has contributed, of course, to these very high numbers, 85,000 cases and up to 2,000 people dead. Stephen, 2 years left for Duterte now in his term. What do you see after this? Do you think this is a president who, after 2 years, will ride into the sunset and let things be? Or do you think he is already hatching a plan on how to exert his influence beyond this time?
Well, there are rumors, and I'll take off on a word that you just used, though. Extend his influence is one thing. To extend his time in office, I don't think he'll do that. I think he'll leave office. But what will happen after that? I think he'll still try to be influential. There's a great problem with Mindanao and Davao in particular, who has been cut out of the national scene for a long, long time. Now that they've been into it, they want to keep that influence, and I think they'll continue to try to be influential.
Greg, certainly Duterte has made headlines all around the world for his very heavy-handed approach and militarized responses to many of those challenges that we have discussed on today's show. What kind of legacy do you think he's already established up until this point, even 2 years before the end of his term?
Well, up until this point with COVID-19, he was sort of the Teflon authoritarian. Nothing seemed to stick to him. Now it's beginning to be tough. To be fair, Philippines doesn't have the death rate from COVID-19 that it might have had without the lockdown, but there's this deficit of trust. The war on drugs has been brutal, but it hasn't worked. The Philippines does need new counterterrorism legislation, but to just arbitrarily arrest and detain people further undermines trust and will be counterproductive. So I think unless there's some very wise thinking and some good luck over the next 12 months, if the expected problems with the pandemic continue and the economy suffers, I mean, no one can really easily fix those problems, then the gloss will really come off Duterte, and he won't perhaps go to the end of his 1 6-year term being able to slide and transition into some ongoing position of power in the way that he was hoping, because his legitimacy is at stake. And I don't know that he's going to be able to solve it. I think he may end up seeing the next 2 years take away a lot of the popular respect that he had over the last 4 years.
His legitimacy is at stake, says Greg Barton. Stephen, do you foresee any scenario under which the mounting pressure that he's facing could even leave him to exit office early or forced to leave office early, or is that out of the question?
So I don't see him voluntarily leaving office. There may be health issues. I mean, he is older, but I also don't see him being removed from office. The Philippine National Police and the Armed Forces of the Philippines don't seem to have any desire to remove him from office. I haven't seen any kind of indication that they'll have any kind of removal at this point. They can still talk to him, and he's done right by them. He's increased their pay, he's increased their equipment, which was left in atrocious conditions over the last few administrations. So they actually, I think they like him, they want him to stay, but they want him to, I'll use the word behave himself when it comes to long-term allies and friends.
Jose, when we're talking about waning popularity and mounting pressure, is that a very international view? Does the look from Manila, does the insular look different so, as far as the assessment and evaluation of President Duterte is concerned?
Well, there are a lot of criticisms already, and like I said, criticisms of the way things are being run. For them to connect it to the president, for the average Filipino to connect it to the president, is something that would be a different matter altogether. Okay, but the thing is that in this past months that we've had this quarantine, the president's manner of engaging the people has led a lot of belief in the among the people that this administration apparently has no direction at all. Okay, he rambles he doesn't inspire. He rambles. His subordinates quarrel with each other. So if you're looking at the legacy of what he's going to leave, it's going to be a country that practically has lost its direction. That would be his legacy, of people who are disunited, who are afraid, who from what was once a promising country in terms of development, now plunging into debt and possible economic recession or even depression.
Is there anything, Jose, that you would give him credit for?
What would I give him credit for? Actually, it's very difficult to answer that question, given the fact that the way that, maybe I would say that be honest, no, I can't really think of anything that I could give him credit for, especially in the case of this pandemic, because of the fact that the manner in which the pandemic was handled, although the way that they glossed over things, the way that they neglected everything in the beginning when it was very crucial, the way they mishandled everything, that is why we're, as a country, suffering right now. So it's very difficult to give him credit for something. Maybe because, precisely there.
Greg, how about yourself? If you look at this very controversial, internationally controversial presidency, is there anything that sticks out to you positively?
Yes, to be fair, the peace deal in the South, it was well in play before Duterte came along, but at least he didn't stop it from happening. It's still unfinished business there. And at the beginning of this year, I feared for the Philippines. I thought that COVID-19 would hit it even worse than it has. And some credit must be given for a tough lockdown. The irony is that the area where Duterte is perhaps done best is where he's getting least credit. And that's because 3.5 years of eroding trust and confidence, just when he seemed to be getting away with this lack of accountability, it's now coming back to bite him with COVID-19. So it's a very mixed scorecard. But in general, he's an authoritarian president who's very headstrong, doesn't listen to advice. It served him better for 3.5 years than it served Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. But now it's catching up with him.
It's catching up. The authoritarian and centralized rule on the part of Duterte is catching up with him. It'll be very interesting to see how the next 2 years will play out indeed. Jose Custodio, Stephen Cutler, and Greg Barton, thank you so much. And thank you out there for watching. Hope to see you again next time for a new edition of Newsmakers.